Hi there, welcome. This is the Kelly's Astrology podcast, where you can find insight, guidance, and understanding through astrology. I'm Kelly, and I'll be your host.
Hey there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Kelly's Astrology podcast. Today, I want to talk about a topic that I have been meaning to talk about for a number of weeks now, and that is Saturn in Aries. I actually want to share 3 tips for working with Saturn in Aries, and that means we're going to talk a little bit about the energy and the condition of Saturn in Aries, and hopefully you'll get some tips about how to work with this very pivotal cycle, not just right at the moment, mid-2025, when we have Saturn in Aries, but also for the longer 2-year cycle of Saturn in Aries, which kicks off in February of 2026. Before we dive into all of these Saturn in Aries tips, I want to let you know that I have 2 webinars that are all about Saturn transits. So one of the best ways to work with Saturn in Aries is to think about what house in your birth chart will Saturn in Aries be activating. And I have a whole deep teaching webinar going through transiting Saturn in each of the 12 houses. Separately, some of you will be very interested in any direct Saturn transits that you might be having to planets that you have in Aries, Cancer, Libra, or Capricorn. And I have a separate webinar that looks at transits from Saturn to all of the visible planets. So if Saturn will be transiting your Sun, your Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, or even your Jupiter over the next couple of years, I have a webinar that will teach you how to interpret that. So those Saturn transits webinars are available on my website, kellysastrology.com. And of course, we will link to them in the show notes below as well. All right, team, so let's get some details on the board. Saturn is in Aries right now, mid-2025. Saturn moved into Aries on May 24 and will stay in Aries until September 1st of 2025. So we have this just over 3-month period in the middle of 2025 where we're all getting our first taste of the Saturn in Aries energy and experience. Then on the 1st of September 2025, Saturn moves back into Pisces, and it's not until February of 2026, I think it's around February 14, 2026, that Saturn will return to Aries, and it will then actually spend a little over 2 years, from February of 26 to April of 2028. So the mid-2025 version of Saturn in Aries is like a taster or a preview that helps you get tuned into and start thinking about what you want to do with this longer Saturn in Aries transit. Now, with a big transit like Saturn in Aries, there are obviously many ways that you could approach this longer transit. And there are so many topics that Saturn in Aries will activate. At the personal level, I mentioned that Saturn in Aries, one of the best ways to work with it as an individual is to think about what house is Aries for you, and therefore what house will Saturn be transiting through. And that's how you can tune into your personal Saturn in Aries transit kind of topics and themes. But there is some general tips to do with the quality of energy of Saturn being in the sign of Aries for this, ultimately 2.5-year period all up. And based on that, I've got 3 tips that I want to share with you about how to work with Saturn in Aries, how to manage it, how to navigate it. So I'm going to lay out the 3 tips, just bullet point them first, and then I will break down what I mean by each of the tips. So the first tip 1, is explore independence. Tip 2 is about embracing instability. And tip 3, choose your breakdown. And I know there's some dramatic titles in those tips, so let me explain to you what I mean by each one. Starting, of course, first with the first tip about exploring independence. So we always hear that Aries is described as an independent sign, which is true. And when I was doing a deep dive on Aries a little earlier this year for some teaching, of course, we've got Neptune in Aries, we've got Saturn in Aries. I'm like, I just want to go deep with the Aries vibe. And I really went into what is independence all about. And it drew me to revisiting some of my studies in counseling and therapy, where I was reminded that independence is an important and necessary developmental stage, but it's not intended to be a stopping point. So if we think about independence from a developmental point of view, we can kind of have some context for the rites and the rituals of independence as part of the kind of normal and necessary growth and maturing of a human. You know, independence is a stage of development. It's typically emphasized through adolescence, where we're all, intended and can benefit from spending some time in cultivating and developing independence. Now, when we're in a phase or a season of life that is really focused on independence, we're learning some skills that are about being independent. We're testing out behaviors and attitudes to do with developing or cultivating an independent spirit and an independent identity. In adolescence, this is often separate from family, and we're sort of testing and exploring things in friendship and work groups. But the idea is that we move through independence and we end up in something called interdependence, a state of being or developmental stage where we spend a lot of our adulthood. And in interdependence, we have a more mature, balanced, collaborative way of being that kind of rounds out the development of a human. Now, that's a very quick synopsis of independence as being an important stage of adolescence. And it's something we're meant to move through to kind of, in our mid to late 20s, to come to a way of being that is more interdependent, which is balancing our sense of ourselves as an independent creature or entity, but also aware that we're in these collaborative relationships and we're going to have a little bit more interaction, collaboration, and support from others, that we don't have to do it all on our own. And the gist here of just taking this quick synopsis of independence and its role in developmental stage is that if the sole focus is on purely becoming independent, what we're really sort of prioritizing is a kind of teenage self-first, me at the center theme. And you could get stuck there. It's important. We know teenagers are very self-oriented. They put themselves at the center of their existence. Sometimes things are dramatic, but it's always from their point of view. And that's an important developmental stage. But if we get stuck there, we stay in this self-first, my needs are the only needs kind of place. And so with planets coming into Aries, for instance, like Saturn in Aries, it can bring almost a collective me first theme forward. And what that might mean is that groups or communities and even countries might be focusing just on what they want, rather than considering how to collaborate or to operate as part of a collective. Because that consideration for others or that participation in a larger dynamic is a more interdependent way of being. Now, from the perspective of Saturn in Aries, the independent mindset being emphasized, it might be encouraging you to put yourself first or to act or react quickly. From that Saturn in Aries point of view, there might be a belief that, or an assumption that others won't help you or they won't support you, even if you haven't checked. And that may help you develop self-reliance or autonomy. It might help you clarify personal boundaries and limits, and it might even help you explore some core identity preferences. So these will be important things to be doing around the topics of the Aries part of your chart and life. Now, for some of us, we might have skipped that independent developmental stage. So Saturn in Aries can be a time where we get this really necessary or helpful refresher about some of these skills associated with independence. For instance, if your boundaries have become really lax, if you're not good at speaking up for what you want, at advocating for your own needs, then Saturn in Aries could be a useful transit to remind you that you get some say around your limits, your priorities, your preferences. On the other hand, if you're overdeveloped around independence, if you're so used to being totally self-reliant and doing it all on your own, you might consider the cost to you of not asking for help or of not working through how to share responsibilities collaboratively with others. Of course, it often seems easier to do things all on your own. There's less discussion and negotiation initially, but it might mean that you're carrying a heavier load later. So these ideas or tips, if you like, around exploring independence can be helpful to reevaluate your relationship to these skills and expression of independence. And it might lead you to clarify where and when you prefer an autonomous approach, where you prefer the Aries way of doing it on your own. But it might also mean that you're gaining some wisdom about when making exclusively independent choices or taking really independent actions might come with more costs than benefits. Something that might seem like a benefit initially could in the long run turn out to be more of a cost. So this is a very quick sort of exploration of why Saturn in Aries is good to help you explore independence, but you don't want to be overly reliant on independent strategies as being your only choice, and to explore the cost of being so independent. Because as much as having that autonomy and that freedom to do what you want when you want, it does mean that other things won't be available. So independence is a natural development stepping stone, but it's something we go through on the way to a more interdependent style of being. And so if you've got stuck in that independent place, or maybe you skipped it altogether, reassessing the ways in which independent choices might be useful for you, or they might be denying you support that could be helpful, this can be an important process, a personal process for our own individual growth as humans. And we can work on this through the longer Saturn in Aries transit. So asking questions about, am I intentionally doing this in an independent way? Is this the right choice? Would I look for collaboration, etc.? So that's point number one, exploring independence. Have I been too independent in this part of my life? Am I not independent enough? And we can think about that very much about the topics of the Aries part of our chart. Point number two was about embracing instability. And here we're getting into some of the more technical features of Saturn in Aries. We're now going to be considering the piece around the technical designation of Saturn in Aries, which is that Saturn is in its full placement in Aries. Now, as a general theme, a planet in fall can create some instability and uncertainty, and it certainly contributes to themes of disintegration. And so the longer Saturn in Aries trend, one key word that I'm thinking about or concept for this longer transit is this idea of disintegration, of things coming apart, being pulled apart, or things kind of falling apart. A planet that is in fall has lost respect or esteem, and it's no longer regarded as highly as it once was. And so if we think about Saturn being in its fall placement, like it's come down off a height, if Saturn has lost respect, then typical Saturn things like structure, stability, protection, clarity, long-term focus and planning, consistency with rules and regulation, safety, established precedents and traditions, all of those Saturnian things are going to become unpredictable and may no longer be upheld. In fact, one of the friction points, of Saturn in Aries is that Saturn is typically very slow and measured and methodical in its approach, like Saturn left to its own devices, for instance. And Saturn tends to prioritize long-term interests. And a lot of these Saturn ways of being, the slow, methodical, measured, the long-term interests, they're almost being set aside or cast aside in favor of the fast-paced, immediate, and reactive kind of short-term priorities of Mars. And that's, of course, because Mars is the ruling planet of Aries. And so any planet in Aries is adopting that kind of Aries-Mars strategy, some to more success than others. And even if you're still struggling to understand the theoretical definitions of planets in fall, for instance, understanding that Saturn is, it's like this rock, this enduring, kind of slow, steady, reliable energy versus that very feisty, immediate, impulsive, short-term, do-it-now vibe of Mars, you can see that there's a clash here, that Saturn is going to feel a little uncomfortable or out of sorts when it's in a sign ruled by Mars. And so as a result of Saturn being in Aries, we do have this disintegrative quality, which is going to create instability. And that might mean that all of a sudden you find that it's really hard to stay on track with long-term projects. Maybe your long-term priorities or goals seem less interesting, or it feels like they're requiring a lot more effort than they used to. Instead, you might find that you're actually distracted by more immediate dramas or this sort of pressing or passing passion, that you're more easily distracted away from the kind of boring but necessary things towards these exciting or dramatic or very hot immediate situations. And so Saturn in Aries can, if you like, throw some of your well-laid plans, some of your long-term plans into chaos, as if you're now questioning what you once thought to be true or important. And so with Saturn in Aries, as you start to review your priorities and timelines, you may end up in a place where things feel unstable because you're no longer certain of what you're doing, why you're doing it, whether you should keep doing it. And so that idea of feeling unsure of what to pursue or focus on may be a part of this Saturn in Aries transit. One of the other ways Saturn in Aries can show up is that instability can come from this sense of rules are changing or the goalpost keeps moving. So when you're no longer sure of what you're working towards, it can raise more questions than answers. And of course, that feeds your uncertainty. As a result, you might need to address immediate matters and temporarily set aside whatever you had previously been focused on. So as a general theme, life is likely to be less stable and more uncertain while Saturn is in Aries. And the questions that you want to reflect on here is, can you find new ways to be okay with the unknown? Can you build a little bit more of a buffer in maybe to your schedule, to your plan, to your budget, so that when things don't quite go as planned, you've got the breathing room? With Saturn in Aries, you might also be thinking, what is it that I want to fight for about this part of my chart in life, the Aries part of my chart in life? Or what is it that I want to fight against in these chaotic times, these times of heightened change? And so we're really being kind of pushed or challenged to think about, how will I build more flexibility into my plans, knowing that I'm currently living in a time where things are more unstable than perhaps, it feels like they have been, or we're in a cycle where instability is really enhanced. So that's point number 2, embracing instability. So how do we kind of make friends with that, or how do we support ourselves to find our way when things are more uncertain and unstable? Point number 3, or tip number 3, is choose your breakdown. And I know this one sounds quite dramatic, but I want to tell you what I mean by this point of choosing your breakdown. So what I mean is that given Saturn's technical fall placement in Aries, there is going to be disintegration. We know that a structure, a system, a tradition, a long established pattern or routine in your life is likely to come undone. So things that have been previously solid and stable, they're up in the air right now. And that is just a feature of the times that we're living in with Saturn in Aries. And if this quality of disintegration is a natural and inherent part of the Saturn in Aries transit, then it may be up to you to be really intentional about where in your life you want to disintegrate habits, patterns, structures, or routines. And Saturn in Aries is really coming from this point of view that nothing lasts forever. And so a feature of this Saturn in Aries cycle can be that it may serve to remind you that time is up on long-running patterns and rhythms and habits and routines. Now, will this process of disintegration and breakdown be messy, at times erratic, and maybe come with periods of doubt? Probably. Now, will you be able to find your way through anyway? Quite likely. And so will life be different after the Saturn in Aries transit? Absolutely. But you get some say in where and how it's different. And so this idea of choose your breakdown is really saying, let's kind of collaborate or co-create with this particular transit. And if we know that Saturn in Aries is going to help us pull things apart and break things down, what is it that I know has kind of maybe come to the end of its kind of natural lifespan? Where in my life do I want to pull things apart? And you can get that kind of personal cheat sheet by thinking about the topics of the Aries part of your chart and how you want to instigate that disintegration in that part of your chart and life. Maybe another way to say this choose your breakdown is to really embrace the uncertainty, to encourage you to find courage to help you be okay with not knowing where you might end up or how things might turn out. You know, Saturn in Aries can be a little bit, I know what I've been doing isn't going to work, or I can't keep it up much longer or any longer, but I'm going to be in an experimental trial and error stage of figuring out what the pattern and the rhythm and the structures here will look like going forward. And keeping that flexibility, it would be reasonable while Saturn is in Aries. So, you know, being okay with not knowing how things might change is a huge kind of stretch process from the perspective of our psyche. But if we're able to kind of embrace that uncertainty and to choose the pulling apart deconstruction process anyway, we're going to really be aligning our intentions with the times that we're living in. So they are my 3 tips. Explore independence, kind of understand the role of independence as well as the pros and cons of independence, embracing that instability, and really consciously and intentionally selecting that choose your breakdown piece. What is it that I want to pull apart here? What is it that I'm bored with, that I feel tired or drained by? What is it that I have no excitement for, that I really want to just let go? And how do I, explore new rhythms from that point of view? So, of course, everyone's going to be relating to Saturn in Aries in their own way. And the simplest way when, sharing information in this kind of large format with lots of you listening is to encourage you to look at the topics of the Aries part of your chart. Everybody has an Aries house somewhere. And so all of us are going to be doing Saturn Aries things around the topics of the Aries house in our chart. But some of you will be entering some more poignant and more pivotal Saturn transit territory with Saturn in Aries. And that's those of you who have important planets and placements in the cardinal signs. So Saturn in Aries, of course, will be making a conjunction to any planet that you have in Aries, but it will also make squares to planets you have in Cancer or Capricorn and oppositions to any planets that you have in Libra. So if you have planets in those cardinal signs, or maybe your ascendant, midheaven, descendant, or IC are in those cardinal signs, at some point between now and April of 2028, you're going to have this personally intense and very defining Saturn transit. And I know people have a lot of fear around Saturn transits. I personally find them really constructive, I should say. Now, Saturn transits, of course, can be a little stressful. We can feel challenged, but some people, many of us, I should say, do our most important growth while we're in a Saturn transit. We connect with really rich wisdom. We become a much more mature, wise version of ourselves. And that's what's on offer for all of us around the topics of our Aries house over the next couple of years. And some of you will be in an even more intensive Saturn kind of transit school experience if you have important planets in cardinal signs. Now, keep in mind, Saturn is in a cardinal sign about every 7 to 8 years. years. And so, this is not new territory for any of you. Anyone who has planets in mutable signs is just coming to the end of their, 2.5-year dance of Saturn in Pisces, and that's affected Gemini and Virgo and Sagittarius, as well as planets in Pisces. And so it's all very doable to work with Saturn. What we want to do is think about taking responsibility. We want to think about setting our intentions in a very clear, practical, grounded way. And we often want to think about honoring our commitments and following through with our choices and obligations. Sometimes in a Saturn transit, you are called to reassess your obligations, and that can sometimes mean bringing more wisdom into the mix. And as a result of that, you may want to update or reorganize your obligations and commitments. Very reasonable to do in a Saturn transit. So this kind of middle period of 2025, which is essentially like June, July, August, which are Saturn in Aries months, they may be like a preview for the longer 2-year Saturn in Aries transit, which runs from Feb 26 to April of 2028. And so really attuning to the Aries part of your chart, getting to know these strategies and tips for working with Saturn in Aries, that's going to help you prepare your personal battle plan for that longer transit of Saturn in Aries kicking off in February of 2026. Now, just one piece that I like to add, because so much of Saturn in Aries is about pulling apart and disintegrating and short-term rather than long-term. The kind of little hint or teaser is that Saturn in Taurus, which starts in April of 2028 when the Saturn in Aries transit finishes. That is a transit that has much stronger themes of building, steadiness, accumulation, foundation, and it is much more about cohering rather than this disintegrating and coming apart. So Saturn in Aries is not forever, but it is for now, for the medium term. And so hopefully these tips will give you some guidelines for how to think about this transit and how to engage with it over the next couple of years. Let me know how Saturn in Aries is going for you so far now that we've had a few weeks of this. You can share your experiences in the comments below. If you have any other questions about Saturn in Aries as a transiting influence, you're welcome to leave them in the comments below and I can keep them in mind for a future podcast. If you do need help on working with the transits of Saturn in your own chart, go and check out those webinars on my website, kellysastrology.com. Thanks so much for joining me. I look forward to sharing more in future episodes. Until then, everyone, take care.